going to take the next 20 minutes to take you through something called peace journalism, most of which may already be part of your common knowledge when it comes to writing, because everybody is part of WorldPulse and we're already writing, we're already talking to each other, and we're already sharing and reading other pieces of information online. But what peace journalism does is to take a little bit of peace education and bring that together with mainstream journalism to create a piece of writing or several pieces of writing that actually convey the truth without taking away from the actual seriousness of the issue. And this is probably one of the common things we're noticing in each of our countries right now, right? Whatever be the news channel, one of the biggest problems we're encountering is how easily that news is sensationalized and how easily that news is fake. Half the time, we don't know who's producing the news we're supposed to read. It could be a blogger in the basement, it could be a news channel with a big corporation behind it, or it could be a political party manipulating hashtags. And none of them are serving our interests. So I'm here to actually share with you peace journalism, but also add a little twist to it, which I want to call feminist peace journalism, which is because it speaks to a lot of things that all of us are doing here as women, both in our societies as well as in the communities we work with, and of course on WorldPulse. So I'm going to turn off my video quickly and share screens so that you can see the slides I've drawn up for today's presentation. So I'm going to take it that you're able to see this screen. I see a lot of bright smiles, so I'm thinking that's yellow being reflected back at you. Okay, wonderful. All right, so what I would advise anybody to do is to feel free to leave any questions that come up in the chat box, or to even feel free to stop me with a raised hand, because if we're dealing with something new, it's great to have it addressed then and there before we go ahead and learn too many new things and feel overwhelmed. But this is only if it feels new, because I do know a lot of you already probably know these things and just haven't yet put the words to it or the technical terms that they have for it in academia. Great, so let's start right at the top. Peace journalism essentially relates to, I have a slow screen, right, sorry. So today we're going to be looking at what peace journalism is, why it matters, what the underlying concept of peace journalism is, which is nonviolent communication, and then we're going to explore a few tips and tricks and how you actually make it operational in the writing that you do. So let's start right at the top. Peace journalism is really all about getting to the issue itself. It's not interested in making noise. It's not interested in screaming sensational headlines or in giving you clickbaiting information that you feel most driven to because of what the headline says, only to discover that it has absolute nonsense inside of it. It's also all about giving you the news exactly as it is. It's not interested in telling you things in exaggerated terms, in unsubstantiated terms, or in just somebody's opinions, is things that may happen but may not happen too. The third thing is it is transparent in exactly all that it has to share with you. If something is the cause of the situation it's describing, it will not hold back. No matter who that person is causing it, or no matter what business interest is causing it, or no matter what big power structure is causing it. So peace journalism is that brand of journalism that's absolutely unafraid, absolutely unrestricted in terms of telling the truth, and most importantly, just very, very dedicated to getting the facts across to you. So when we think of the word peace, automatically in our mind, there's the automatic opposite of that, which is war. And we often think of it in terms of binaries. We think of peace as the absence of war. But the truth is, peace is the presence of a range of different things that can make sure that war doesn't happen in the future. So things like justice, things like human rights, things like freedom of speech and expression, things like keeping communities in check with ways that understand what doing that would actually imply for each community within that larger group. So peace journalism focuses on revealing the suffering inflicted on people of all parties involved in the conflict. So let's take, for example, what we're seeing in the news right now with the lockdowns around the world, COVID-19. Now, some of the mainstream news is concerned exclusively about what this is doing to the large businesses and the large economies, and how several already rich and powerful communities are taking a beating. But when you think about the impact of the lockdown in the larger sense of the term, you can also see that migrant labor, women, trans communities, LGBTQIA people, people with disabilities, animals, so many different communities are being affected because of the policy to lock down. And peace journalism will not shy away from telling these stories. It brings attention to the stories that actually exist on ground through transparent, credible and accountable resources. Within that, it also tries to focus on solutions. The attention is on peaceful stories, on efforts towards resolution, on efforts towards peace, and on efforts towards making things change. Now, why does it matter when you already have the mainstream media and then you have activists like many of us in here that are already telling our stories? Why does peace journalism actually matter? Peace journalism is a beautiful link between the mainstream media and activists on ground because it brings to the both of them the very resources that they don't yet have to be able to reach each other's levels. So when you think about being an activist, you're often talking about what's informing your work in your everyday. And that possibly could be 1/10 of the story when you think about what's happening in the community around you, but the numbers could be larger, could be confused, or could be smaller. And when we look at it through a peace journalism angle, we're willing to look at what others who are quote unquote competing with us are actually doing to make a solution possible. Now, in the world that we exist in, a lot of us are in competition with each other. Not in WorldPulse, we love each other, but outside of WorldPulse, our competition actually can be destructive to each other. So much so that we forget what it is to collaborate with each other. And peace journalism brings you back to the space where you recognize everybody's agency to speak truth to power and recognizes that agency by placing it in the hands of every person who has a voice by passing the mic to them and collaborating without appropriating. So it is essentially the most truest, the most meaningful, and the most real form of journalism that could possibly exist because it's telling you the truth. And most often, when you talk about peace journalism being telling your truth and speaking your truth to power, you're also speaking about who is actually holding the pen when they write it. So it is citizen-led, it's community-led, it is society-led, it is bottom-up. It is the everyday life that is affected by a reality that is speaking up and talking to you about what's happening. It's that blog post that comes from a survivor of gender-based violence telling you everything she went through because she was reporting a case, but the police wouldn't listen to her, or society was unfair to her, or that she lives under stigma today. It's that blog post from an environmental activist who's telling you that the policy that was made in Paris is not transferring to the grassroots because the political leadership does not want to commit. It is that important blog post that takes on political change and asks for it to be meaningful and impactful to every community that it can affect, directly or indirectly. So in sum, it's inclusive, it's about being wholesome, it's about being respectful, and it's about focusing on solutions. Now I'm going to take a moment here and deviate a little bit to what war journalism looks like, so you can actually see it as a contrast. And I don't have a slide for it here, but I want you to think about any of the recent pieces of news that you've read that talk about certain aspects of the news with great sensationalism. Now, one of the most common forms of war journalism that women encounter is when when women political leaders either run for office or become prominent in public spaces. The first thing you see the news writing about is their appearance, what they wore, that they weren't smiling enough, that they weren't sitting properly, or howsoever they want to talk about the woman's everything else but her political views. Another form is also taking pot shots at a person's past, using what is called presentism, which is an interesting concept where you look at history, but with what you know now, which is absolutely unfair. Instead of introspecting on ourselves to change, we're busy dissecting other people with our understanding of what we know now and to judge what has happened in the past. And these are very commonly deployed tactics and approaches that are used mainly to fight politics through the media, which is why you now actually have politically backed media houses that have resources that support a political party or pursue a political agenda, almost entirely at the cost of a different party or a different agenda. And that is war journalism because it's pitching two different communities against one another, not just at the political party level, but at the grassroots, the voters, the communities, the people whose rights are being affected in their everyday life. So peace journalism is an answer to every one of those problems. It is the biggest speech of truth to power. So let's go a little bit to what actually underlies peace journalism. What is the basis for it? So there's a beautiful concept in peace education called nonviolent communication, which means that we need to start not being violent from within, from the way we word what we want to say, all the way up outside into our actions, the kind of things that we choose to do. So nonviolent communication is exactly that. It's not violent. It's inclusive. It looks at getting the message across in ways that do not trigger another person, that do not harm another person, that do not put another person's life, mental health, peace of mind, or even comfort at danger. And what nonviolent communication asks you to do is to start observation. Make an observation available without judgment, which means that if you are looking at something that's happening in the world around you, let's say you're on ground, you're an aid worker for COVID-19, and you're observing how the political party or the local leadership or the community is being difficult about observing the lockdown rules. So you can start with that observation instead of making a judgment, instead of saying the people in my community are stupid because dot dot dot. No. What about if we said every day we notice so many people are not observing the rules of the lockdown? Once you establish something in an unbiased fashion, it means that you're presenting the fact exactly as it exists to the reader. And once you finish that, you have all the space to express your feelings. But you express your feelings in what they call I, we, and you language. So when you say I feel, I believe, I think, it means that you're qualifying what you have to say with your own perception of it all, which means then the person who's reading it can understand that it's not proven fact, that it's not something that they can go out there to the world and say, somebody said this is true, and so therefore I will use this to spread news in my community. It becomes an opinion, it becomes an idea, a thought, a feeling that you express in response to what you've observed. And then you start with identifying and articulating the need that comes from those feelings. So let's stick with the same example. Let's say you were talking about people not observing lockdown or social distancing in your community. So let's say you say, every morning when I wake up, I find outside my house several people walking without observing social distancing. This makes me feel scared. This makes me uncomfortable. Or this makes me angry. Please remember, every one of your feelings are valid. Don't self-censor your feelings. You're entitled entirely to express your feelings, but you do it in ways that are non-violent, so that the person receiving it is acknowledged and respected for what they're going through. Now, I'm going to take a bit of a pause here, take a tiny diversion and come right back to this list. But what nonviolent communication asks you to do is to be empathetic about the person that's consuming the information you are producing. That person who you're reading, who you're writing to, or who's consuming your writing, is probably coming to your piece of writing with whatever is happening in their lives. And they may have taken certain actions that you are calling out in your article. But you can't polarize them. It's not fair to polarize them. It's not fair to push them away. It's not fair to brand them a certain way. It's only kind if you embrace what's happened, talk about your feelings, and build a bridge with the person who's receiving that information in ways that they become inspired to introspect and change things about themselves. So coming back there then, once you finish identifying and articulating every need that emerges from those feelings, go back to the example there. So when we said it makes me feel scared or fearful or angry or irritable, we can also say, I wish people would acknowledge that this disease is bigger than all of us. I wish, or I really hope more people would respond to the need for social distancing. And the more strictly we observe it, the sooner this is all going to be over. So when you make statements like that, you finish off with a clear request to meet that need. Nonviolent communication is a really great formula, even if you're building petitions, even if you're building official documents where you want to build a policy for a community or a policy for the groups that you work with, or even an office document that you want to use for your employees or the people you work with. So moving there, we're going to go to the last part, which talks about a few tips and tricks in terms of how you manage telling your story through the lens of peace journalism. The first, and I know I'm speaking to veterans in this art, but you speak your story. Just as we do in WorldPulse, speak your story. There's a beautiful saying which says when somebody is writing your story, one has to be very careful who's holding the pen. And that goes back to the idea that only you know yourself best. Only you know your feelings best. Only you know what's going on inside your mind best. So it's the easiest thing to start by speaking your story. Now, there's also something important that goes with this. When you tell your story, you become the master of it, naturally. But when you become the master of your story, it is also important to understand that people on the other side are consuming your story and are probably going to engage with your story in a certain way. So you become the one to make a decision on what you want to share, what you don't want to share, and what you want to withhold. The second important thing is to stay authentic. How do you stay authentic? You start from exactly where you are. It doesn't matter how different your life may be from that of a reader. It doesn't matter how somebody's problems may seem way bigger than what it is that you are going through. But the point is, you are valid. You are who you are. Your existence is important, and you are part of a global sisterhood. And so, the least you can do to help yourself is to present your authentic and true self exactly as you are. The third important thing to bear in mind is to do your research in advance. Now, this is obviously going to come into play when it's not your story or your own personal narrative, but about something that's happening around you in your community. A couple of days ago, one of my former teachers, my high school teachers, put up a Facebook status message because she received something on WhatsApp which she thought was true. Now, most people were able to tell within seconds of reading it that that information was not true, but there was also a sense of fear to speak to her because she taught them at some point, even if high school was a long way back. So what people started doing was to report the post, which did not really change the change the situation. It did not automatically mean that she's not going to come at people with a post like that again. So instead, if somebody brought their research and presented that research to share with her that that piece of news was not correct, was not authentic, was not valid, then that may actually go a long way because it would help her think about what she's putting up, how she needs to reframe the things she's choosing to put up, and how best she does her research to make that possible. The next thing is to be very mindful and not sensationalize. Yes, a lot of things are suffering. Yes, a lot of things are pain. Yes, a lot of things are trauma. And these things need to be heard. But it's important to understand that when a story is being told, you need to be as fact oriented as possible than to actually present it through the lens of sensationalism. Most of us are fed up with the news when it screams out loud, right? I think in every country we have that one news host who we cannot stand because he knows how to scream more than to speak. I see a few smiles, so I think I'm going to take that as a yes. We each have one, and we're fed up of them. And we don't want to be them when we write either. So it's important to be mindful not to sensationalize. Empathy, respect, and equality are absolutely important. Empathy for yourself, for what you're putting out there, and empathy for the person who's consuming the story. Respect and equality for every individual that you're working through into your narrative. No matter whether that's a politician that you can't stand, no matter whether that is a friend that you had a conversation with who you think you can name without asking, you've got to maintain these three values. Absolutely important. Never add information that you cannot personally verify, and always make sure to add links to whatever stories it is that you're referencing or you're basing your article on. Sources lend credibility. Triangulating any report that you receive, whatever piece of information that you receive. And I know a lot of women in this group are engaged in doing aid work on ground. And it's especially important, and I'm sure my sisters that are doing aid work will agree. Before you give aid work, the first thing you do is to verify if the recipient that you're going to give that aid to actually needs it, if they're actually in a situation that puts them in its place of disadvantage. And the same rule applies here as well. So, to put a bow on things, I'm going to say thank you for listening to me. I think we worked in 19 minutes and 1